So this is power dynamics of majority, minority, deep identity behaviors. This is what I call the dance, okay? That majorities, however you define the majorities are raised in a culture of power. If you have been one of a handful of ethnic or racial minorities in a room full of white people, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you have been one of a few or a handful of women in a room full of men, you know what I'm talking about. If you have been one of a few or a handful of men in a room full of women, you know what I'm talking about. This is not, this fluctuates depending on who is perceived to be in the minority, who is perceived to be in the majority. I'll tell you a story about this, but let's go through this really quickly. So majorities are raised in a culture of power. The majorities assume that they're in control. Their control is largely good and benign, that everyone benefits from them being in control, including the minorities. In general, minorities are raised in a culture of powerlessness. For people in the minority, there's an assumption that they're not in control. Number one, I can't get in control, and number two, I'm not responsible for anything in the society. That their lack of control exposes them to hazards and dangers, and the control of the majority is for the benefit of the majority, not for the benefit of the minority. That control is always seen as self-serving. So let's go through a table of how people in these conditions look at themselves. So our first table is how people in the minority look at themselves. We're not going to go through all of this. We're going to look at the first one. Minorities believe they're being punished for speaking up and expressing themselves. This gives them a feeling of being oppressed and a feeling of powerlessness that contributes to the culture of powerlessness. Minorities believe that they're not allowed to speak for themselves and that their views are not heard. Minorities believe that they're not allowed to have power. The next one is very important. Every single act of violence or oppression toward any minority group member is known and felt by the entire minority community. This lets you feel victimized, okay? And again, when you start looking at the instances of violence, I said I was doing well with time. If I start telling stories, I won't be. So minorities believe that they're politically and socially marginalized, that they're unseen and unheard, and minorities only feel secure with members of their own identity group, which gives them a feeling of being isolated, which gives them the part of the culture of isolation. You start looking at the minority cultures, powerlessness, victimization, invisibility, and isolation. Those cultures feed themselves. In order to get out of those cultures, you have to consciously want to and consciously break those cultures, okay? And there are ways to do it. As I'm sitting here, I'm demonstrating there's a way to do that, okay? But we have to be clear on how that gets done. So let's move on to how people in the majority look at themselves. Majorities believe that they have a right to speak up and express themselves. This gives you a feeling of being normal, of being satisfied. It gives you a feeling of being, really okay with yourself, being a superior person. This feeds a culture of superiority. Majorities believe that they can speak for all people and that the majority viewpoint is held by everybody else. Again, this helps me to feel normal. Majorities believe that they behave in an accepted, normal way. The majority imposes the order. They impose cultural norms. Bad actions by an individual minority group member are seen by the majority as universal and typical. I'm going to say that one again. Bad actions by an individual minority group member are seen by the majority as universal and typical. So right now, there's a very tragic killing that was done some time ago, and the suspect in the killing, that person's not been convicted of anything yet. The suspect in the killing is a undocumented Mexican national. The right-wing newspapers are going crazy saying that we need the wall to protect ourselves from that one individual. The guy that's cutting your lawn right now is also the murdering rapist that because all of them are that way. The bad actions of majority members are seen as not representative of the norm. So when you see when a majority member acts bad, it's like, oh, he's mentally disturbed, he or she is has some some problem, but that's their problem as an individual. They don't represent my group. Majority supports other members of the majority. That way they feel empowered. Majorities don't understand minority issues and don't particularly want to. Majority members believe they are secure only with members of their own group. And people who don't act like the majority are deviant in some way. Okay, so this gives you lots of different cultures of superiority, self-empowerment, isolation, etc. And what that does is so these two cultural realities are reinforcing and self-reinforcing. What happens if we move away from all of it? If we move away from the entire dynamic of it, and we start looking at a whole different culture, and we start actively practicing and developing a culture of inclusivity.